cold came first, then the hunger. Wyatt Boone had stopped feeling his fingers somewhere around dawn 3 days back. Now he couldn't remember what it felt like to be warm, to be full, to be anything other than a hollow shell on horseback chasing a man who might not even exist anymore. His horse, a gray mare named Ash, moved beneath him with the mechanical patience of an animal too tired to question its rider's judgment. Her breath came out in white clouds that hung in the air before dissolving into the vast nothing of the Montana highlands. Everything here was white or gray, the snow, the sky, the bare branches of the aspens that stood like skeletal hands reaching toward a sun that gave light but no warmth. Wyatt's stomach had gone past growling. It had moved into a hollow, gnawing ache that made his vision swim at the edges. He'd eaten the last of his jerky 2 days ago, rationing it down to strings so thin they dissolved on his tongue before he could chew. There was nothing out here. No towns, no homesteads, no game stupid enough to be wandering these ridges in late November. Just endless white, and the tracks he'd been following, tracks that might belong to Jacob Sutter, the man who'd killed a shopkeeper in Billings over a bad card game, or might belong to some drifter who had nothing to do with anything. Out here, it was hard to tell the difference between justice and obsession. The wind picked up, cutting through his coat like it wasn't even there. Wyatt pulled his scarf higher over his face, but it didn't help much. His lips were cracked and bleeding. His hands looked like something pulled from a grave. He should turn back. He knew that. Any reasonable man would have turned back yesterday. But Wyatt Boone had never been good at reasonable. He'd been tracking men for 5 years now, ever since he'd pinned on a deputy's badge in a town so small it didn't even have a name on most maps. He was good at it, good at reading sign, good at pushing through when his body screamed at him to stop, good at becoming the kind of relentless that made guilty men sloppy. But this was different. This was stupid. The tracks he'd been following had started to fade an hour ago, covered by fresh snow that fell in lazy spirals from a sky the color of old pewter. Soon there'd be nothing left to follow at all. Ash stumbled, caught herself, kept moving. "I know," Wyatt said, his voice a rasp that hurt his throat. "I know, girl." He'd give it another hour, maybe 2. Then he'd admit defeat and start the long ride back to civilization, assuming he had enough strength left to make it. That's when the smell hit him. It came on the wind, so faint at first that Wyatt thought he was imagining it, a cruel trick played by a brain starved of everything except desperation. But Ash smelled it too. Her head came up, ears swiveling forward with sudden interest. Smoke. Wood smoke, rich and clean. And something else. Something that made Wyatt's stomach clench with a hunger so fierce it nearly bent him double. Cooking. Someone was cooking. Wyatt didn't think. He just gave Ash her head and let her follow the scent, moving down the ridge toward a stand of pines that looked like every other stand of pines in this whole frozen hellscape. His hand went to the Colt on his hip, not drawing it, just checking it was there. Out here, you didn't stumble onto camps by accident, and people cooking in the middle of nowhere usually had a reason for being nowhere. The trees thickened as they descended, providing some relief from the wind. The smell grew stronger, definitely meat, definitely something seasoned with herbs he couldn't identify, but that made his mouth flood with saliva so fast he had to spit into the snow. Through the pines, he caught the flicker of firelight. Wyatt dismounted, his legs nearly buckling when his boots hit the ground. He tied Ash to a low branch and moved forward on foot, keeping to the shadows, his hand now resting on the grip of his Colt. The camp was small, just a fire ring, a bedroll, and a single figure standing over a Dutch oven that sat nested in the coals. No tent, no horse that Wyatt could see, just the fire and the person tending it. A woman. Wyatt stopped, his mind trying to catch up with what his eyes were telling him. She was alone. A woman, alone in the highlands in November, cooking like she was standing in her own kitchen instead of in the middle of a wilderness that killed men twice her size just for the sport of it. She was big, not tall, but substantial, with a build that spoke of strength rather than softness. Her coat was good quality. Her boots looked new. Dark hair pulled back in a braid that hung down her back. She moved with the kind of economy that came from someone who'd done the same task 1,000 times and knew exactly how much effort to waste on it, which was none. She hadn't looked up, hadn't acknowledged his presence at all, even though there was no way she hadn't heard Ash moving through the snow. Wyatt's hand tightened on his Colt. This felt wrong. All of it. You planning to shoot me or just stand there breathing loud enough to scare off everything with ears for 5 miles? Her voice cut through the clearing without her turning around. Low, steady, with an edge that suggested she wasn't particularly concerned about either option. Wyatt's jaw tightened. He didn't move his hand from his gun. Didn't mean to intrude. Yes, you did. She still didn't turn around. Otherwise, you would have called out when you were on the ridge. Instead, you snuck down here like a thief, which means you either wanted to rob me or you wanted to see what you were dealing with before you committed to politeness. She had him there. Wyatt took a breath, tasting the smell of whatever she was cooking on the back of his throat. It made him dizzy. I've been on the trail for days, haven't eaten since Tuesday. Today's Friday. I know what day it is. Do you? Now she did turn, and Wyatt got his first good look at her face. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe 30, with dark eyes that assessed him with the kind of thoroughness usually reserved for livestock at auction. Not pretty in the way men wrote poems about, but striking in a way that made pretty seem irrelevant. You look like something a wolf dragged halfway to the den before deciding you weren't worth the effort. Feel about the same. She studied him for another moment, then turned back to her Dutch oven. You armed? Yes. How armed? Colt on my hip, rifle on my saddle. That it? Wyatt hesitated, then pulled the knife from his boot and held it up. This. Anything else you're not mentioning? No. She lifted the lid off the Dutch oven, and steam billowed up into the cold air, carrying a smell that made Wyatt's knees genuinely weak. You come at me with any of those weapons, and I'll kill you with this ladle. We clear? It should have sounded ridiculous. A woman threatening him with a cooking utensil. It didn't sound ridiculous at all. Clear, Wyatt said. Good. Sit down before you fall down. You look like you're about 10 seconds from face planting into my fire, and I don't feel like dragging a man-sized corpse anywhere tonight. Wyatt didn't argue. He moved to the far side of the fire, close enough to feel its warmth, but far enough that she wouldn't feel crowded, and lowered himself to the ground with less grace than he would have liked. His vision swam. He blinked it clear. The woman, he still didn't have a name for her, pulled a plate from her pack. Tin, battered but clean. She ladled something from the Dutch oven onto it, grabbed a spoon, and walked around the fire to hand it to him. Eat slow, she said. You gulp it down on an empty stomach and you'll just throw it back up, which would be a waste of good elk. Wyatt took the plate. His hands were shaking, not from the cold, from the smell, from the proximity to food after days of nothing. The first bite hit his tongue, and he actually made a sound he would have been embarrassed about if he'd had the capacity for embarrassment left in him. It was elk, like she'd said, but it wasn't just elk. It was elk braised in something rich and complex, with wild onions and herbs he couldn't name, and something else, berries maybe, or some kind of root, that cut through the richness and made him want to weep. Slow, she reminded him. He forced himself to slow down, even though every instinct screamed at him to shovel it in as fast as his throat could handle. Each bite was a revelation. Each bite reminded him that food could be more than fuel, that it could be something close to sacred when it was done right. When the plate was empty, she took it from him without a word and ladled more. He ate that too, slower this time, letting his stomach adjust to the shock of actual nourishment. When the second plate was gone, the woman settled on the other side of the fire and watched him with those dark, assessing eyes. You got a name? She asked. Wyatt Boone. Boone, like Daniel Boone. No relation. Shame. Might have made you more interesting. She poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up into the darkening sky. I'm Mara Holloway. What are you doing out here, Mara Holloway? Same thing you are, I imagine. Looking for something. I'm tracking a man. I'm tracking a life that doesn't make me want to set things on fire. She gave him a thin smile. How's your hunt going? Lost the trail about 2 hours ago. So not great. Not great, Wyatt agreed. He flexed his fingers, feeling warmth start to return to them. You always camp alone in the highlands in November? You always ask women you just met to explain themselves? Fair enough. They sat in silence for a while. The fire popped and crackled. The wind moved through the pines with a sound like the world breathing. Wyatt's stomach, full for the first time in days, had stopped hurting and started feeling almost human again. I was a cook, Mara said finally. In Billings. Worked at the Grand Hotel for 3 years. Best cook they'd ever had, according to everyone who wasn't the owner. What happened? Her jaw tightened. They decided I wasn't the right image for the hotel. Said they wanted someone more refined, more delicate. Someone who looked like she belonged in a fine establishment, instead of someone who looked like she could break a man in half if she felt like it. Wyatt kept his expression neutral. He'd seen enough of the world to know what she wasn't saying, that they'd fired her because of how she looked, because she was a woman who took up space in a world that preferred women who didn't. That when you decided to head for the Highlands? That's when I decided to stop pretending the world was going to be fair just because I was good at what I did. She jabbed her stick into the fire harder than necessary. I heard there's opportunities in Bozeman. New hotels going up, new restaurants, gold money still floating around from the strikes last year. Figured I'd try my luck there. Bozeman's a week's ride from here. I'm aware. You're traveling alone. I'm aware of that too. She looked at him across the fire. You got a point you're working toward? Or are you just cataloging facts you think I don't know? Wyatt held up his hands. Just making conversation. Well, make it about something else. I've had enough men tell me what I should or shouldn't be doing to last me several lifetimes. Not telling you anything, just observing. Your observations aren't as subtle as you think they are. Wyatt couldn't help it. He smiled. You always this prickly with people who stumble into your camp half dead? Only the ones who look at me like I'm a problem that needs solving. But some of the edge had left her voice. She pulled the Dutch oven away from the coals and set it aside to cool. You heading back to wherever you came from? Eventually. Need to regain enough strength to make the ride without falling off my horse. How long you been out here? 6 days. Chasing one man? He killed someone over a card game. Thought he should answer for it. Mara snorted. Men kill each other over stupider things than cards. You can't chase down every one of them. Don't plan to, just this one. Why? It was a good question. Wyatt didn't have a good answer. Because someone should. That's not a reason. That's an excuse to avoid going home to wherever home is and dealing with whatever you left there. She wasn't wrong. Wyatt stood, his legs more stable now that he had food in him. I should see to my horse. She's been carrying me all day without complaint. Water's in the creek about 20 yards that way. Mara pointed north. Don't take her too far from camp. Wolves have been active the last couple of nights. Noted. He found Ash where he'd left her, patient as always, her breath frosting in the growing dark. He untacked her, rubbed her down with handfuls of dry pine needles the best he could, and walked her to the creek. The water was so cold it made his teeth ache just watching her drink, but she didn't seem to mind. When he brought her back, Mara had laid out his bedroll on the opposite side of the fire from hers. She'd also set out a small pile of grain, oats mixed with something else, that hadn't been there before. For your horse, she said without looking up. She's earned it more than you have. I'm not going to argue with that. Ash went for the grain like she'd been personally blessed by every saint in the canon. Wyatt sat down on his bedroll and worked his boots off, wincing at the blisters he knew were waiting under his socks, but was too tired to investigate. You planning to head back tomorrow? Mara asked. Probably. No point staying out here if the trail's cold. Which direction? South? Back toward Billings, probably. Check in. Let them know Sutter's in the wind. Mara was quiet for a moment. Then, I'm heading west to Bozeman, like I said. Long ride alone. Is that an offer or another observation I didn't ask for? Wyatt looked at her across the fire. She was staring right back, her expression unreadable in the dancing light. Might be an offer, depends on whether you're interested. In what exactly? Company? Protection, if you need it. I'm handy with a gun, and I know these mountains well enough. And what do you want in return? 3 meals a day that don't taste like saddle leather and despair. The corner of her mouth twitched. Almost a smile. Almost. You think I need protection? I think traveling alone through the highlands in winter is dangerous for anyone, regardless of how tough they are. I think 2 people have better odds than 1, and I think... He stopped, trying to find the right words. I think you cook like someone who understands that food is more than just fuel, that it's something worth respecting. I haven't eaten a meal that good in 5 years. Mara studied him for a long moment. You're not going to get weird about traveling with a woman, are you? Start acting like you need to make decisions for me or tell me how things should be done. No. You're not going to assume that because I'm cooking for you, I'm doing anything else for you? No. You're not going to wake up one morning and decide that you know better than me about my own life? No. How do I know you mean that? You don't. Wyatt met her eyes. But I've got nowhere else to be, and you're the first interesting person I've met in 6 months. I figure that's worth taking a chance on. She huffed out a breath that might have been a laugh. Interesting. That's a new one. Would you prefer formidable? I'd prefer if men stopped trying to put me in categories at all, but we don't always get what we want. She poked at the fire again, watching the sparks. All right, you can come with me to Bozeman, but we're setting ground rules. I'm listening. First, I'm in charge of the route. I know where I'm going, and I'm not interested in debating the best way to get there. Agreed. Second, you pull your weight. I'm not your mother, and I'm not your maid. You set up your own camp, you clean your own dishes, you carry your own load. Wouldn't have it any other way. Third, if I tell you to do something related to staying alive in these mountains, you do it without question. I've been traveling this country for 3 weeks now, and I've learned things. You want my cooking, you follow my lead when it comes to survival. That one gave him pause. Wyatt had been taking care of himself in the wilderness since he was 15 years old. Taking orders from anyone, especially someone he'd just met, went against every instinct he had. But he'd also been half dead from starvation when he'd stumbled into her camp, and she'd been alone out here for 3 weeks without issue. Maybe his instincts could use some updating. Agreed, he said. Good. She stood, brushing off her pants. We leave at first light. Get some sleep. You look like hell. Feel like it too. Tomorrow won't be easier. If you can't keep up, I'm not waiting for you. I'll keep up. She gave him a look that said she'd believe it when she saw it, then moved to her own bedroll and started unlacing her boots. Wyatt lay back and stared up at the sky, watching the stars come out between the branches of the pines. His stomach was full. His body was warm, or at least warmer than it had been. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was chasing ghosts. He felt like he was moving towards something instead of running from it. It was a strange feeling, not entirely comfortable, but not unwelcome either. Boone, Mara said from the darkness across the fire. Yeah? Thanks for not being an asshole about it. About what? You know what? He did know. He knew exactly what she meant, that most men, stumbling onto a woman alone in the wilderness, would have made assumptions. Would have seen someone to be rescued, or someone to take advantage of, or someone who needed to be educated on how the world really worked. Wyatt had seen someone who'd kept herself alive in a place that tried to kill everything it touched. Someone who could turn an elk into something close to poetry with nothing but a Dutch oven and a campfire. Someone worth listening to. You're welcome, he said. The fire burned down to coals, the temperature dropped. Wyatt pulled his blanket tighter and let the sound of the wind through the pines carry him toward sleep. Tomorrow, they'd head west. Together. It seemed like as good a plan as any. But morning came cold and clear. The sky, that particular shade of blue that only happened in the mountains when the air was so clean it hurt to breathe. Wyatt woke to the smell of coffee. Real coffee. Not the chicory swill he'd been drinking for the last week, and bacon sizzling in a pan. Mara was already up, already moving, her bedroll packed and her camp broken down, except for the cooking fire. She'd pulled her hair back in a fresh braid, and her face had the kind of set to it that said she'd been awake for a while, thinking. Coffee's in the pot, she said without preamble. Bacon's almost done. We eat fast and we move. Weather's changing. Wyatt sat up, his body protesting in 6 different languages. Everything hurt. His back, his legs, his hands, his feet. The price of sleeping on frozen ground after days in the saddle. He poured himself coffee from the battered tin pot sitting at the edge of the fire and took a sip that nearly made him weep for the second time in 12 hours. It was perfect, strong enough to wake the dead, hot enough to thaw his insides, with just enough bitterness to remind him he was alive. You're good at this, he said. At making coffee? At all of it. Food, camp, survival, all of it. Mara flipped the bacon with more force than strictly necessary. People are always surprised when women are competent. Like we're all just stumbling through life waiting for a man to come along and show us how to boil water. That's not what I meant. Isn't it? No. Wyatt took another sip of coffee. I meant that you're operating at a level most people who spend their entire lives in the wilderness don't reach. That's worth acknowledging. She glanced at him, something like surprise flickering across her face before she shuddered it away. Well, don't hurt yourself handing out compliments. Wasn't a compliment, just a fact. Everything's a compliment when it comes from a man's mouth. That's how the world works. She pulled the bacon off the fire and divided it onto 2 plates with the same efficiency she did everything else. But I'll take it anyway. Eat up. We've got a hard day ahead. The bacon was perfect too. Crispy on the edges, still tender in the middle, seasoned with something that tasted like sage and black pepper. Wyatt ate it slowly, savoring each bite, watching Mara break down the last of the camp with the kind of practiced precision that spoke to years of experience. She moved like someone who'd never had the luxury of wasting energy. Every action had a purpose. Every motion was economical. No fuss, no wasted time, no second guessing. Wyatt had met plenty of men who talked a big game about being mountain men, about living off the land and surviving by their wits. Most of them would have been dead in a week out here. Mara had been out here for 3 weeks and looked like she could go another 3 without breaking a sweat. "You learn all this from your family?" he asked, helping her kick dirt over the fire. "Some of it. My father was a trapper before he settled down. Taught me how to read weather, how to find water, how to tell the difference between tracks from this morning and tracks from 3 days ago." She shouldered her pack, adjusting the straps. "The cooking I learned from my mother and her mother before that. Recipes that go back far enough that nobody remembers where they came from anymore, just that they work. They more than work. Yeah, well, working wasn't enough for the Grand Hotel." She said it matter of fact, but Wyatt heard the edge underneath. "You ready?" "As I'll ever be." They mounted up, Mara on a sturdy brown gelding she called Bear that had been picketed somewhere in the trees overnight, and headed west through the pines. The morning was quiet except for the creak of saddle leather and the soft thud of hooves on snow. Mara led. Wyatt followed. It was a strange reversal for him. He was used to being the one in front, making the decisions, choosing the route. But Mara navigated the highlands like she'd been born to them, picking paths through the snow that avoided the worst of the drifts and the steepest of the climbs. By noon, they'd covered more ground than Wyatt had managed in the previous 2 days. "You always ride this hard?" he asked during a brief stop to rest the horses. "You always ride this soft?" she countered. Fair point. She pulled out a canteen and took a long drink, then offered it to him. "We need to make the valley before dark. There's a cabin there, abandoned but intact. We can shelter for the night." "How do you know about it?" "Same way I know about everything out here. I pay attention." She capped the canteen and stowed it. "You see that ridge?" She pointed to a line of exposed rock to the north. "That's the edge of the really bad weather. We stay south of it, we're fine. We drift north, we're in trouble." Wyatt studied the ridge, committing it to memory. What kind of trouble? "The kind where the snow comes down so hard you can't see your hand in front of your face, and the temperature drops so fast your eyelashes freeze to your cheeks. I lost a day up there during my 2nd week out. Nearly lost more than that." "But you made it through." "Obviously." She swung back into the saddle with an ease that belied her size. "Doesn't mean I'm interested in repeating the experience. Come on, we're burning daylight." They rode through the afternoon, the landscape shifting from dense pine forests to more open terrain, rolling hills covered in snow, broken up by stands of aspen and the occasional stream that hadn't frozen solid yet. The sky stayed clear, but Wyatt could feel the change Mara had mentioned earlier. The wind had shifted directions, coming now from the northwest, carrying with it the promise of weather. Mara felt it too. He could tell by the way she kept glancing at the horizon, by the way she pushed Bear a little harder than she had that morning. They were racing something. Wyatt just hoped they'd win. The cabin appeared just as the sun started its slide toward the western peaks, a small structure tucked into a fold in the hills, barely visible until you were almost on top of it. The roof was intact, the door still on its hinges. Not much, but enough. "Home sweet home," Mara said, dismounting. "Get the horses settled. I'll check inside, make sure we're not sharing the space with anything that has more teeth than we do." Wyatt led both horses to a small lean-to attached to the side of the cabin, not much more than a roof and 3 walls, but enough to cut the wind, and unsaddled them. There was even some old hay in one corner, musty but edible. He divided it between Ash and Bear, then filled their water buckets from the stream that ran 20 yards behind the cabin. By the time he finished, Mara had the cabin door open and smoke rising from the chimney. Inside was one room, maybe 15 feet on a side. A stone fireplace on the far wall, a rough table and 2 chairs, a single cot with a straw mattress that had seen better days. Not luxurious, but after 6 nights on frozen ground, it looked like the finest hotel room Wyatt had ever seen. Mara had already claimed the cot, her pack and bedroll tossed on it with the kind of casual authority that said this wasn't up for debate. Wyatt didn't care. The floor near the fire would be warmer than anywhere he'd slept recently. "There's a root cellar," Mara said, kneeling by a trap door near the fireplace. "Looks like whoever lived here last left in a hurry. There's still supplies down there." "How long ago?" "Months, maybe. Hard to tell." She descended into the cellar and came back up with an armful of goods: dried beans, a sack of flour, some withered carrots, and a jar of what looked like preserved venison. "People abandon these places all the time. Winter gets too hard, they head for town and never come back. Their loss is our gain." "That's one way to look at it." She set the supplies on the table and started sorting through them, her hands moving with the same practiced efficiency she brought to everything. "I can make us a stew with this. Won't be fancy, but it'll be hot." "I'm not complaining." "You better not be. You're eating better with me than you have in months, I'd wager." "Years," Wyatt corrected. That earned him a glance that might have been approval. "Help me with the water. There's a pot in the corner." They fell into an easy rhythm, Wyatt fetching water from the stream while Mara prepared the ingredients. Neither of them talking much, but the silence comfortable rather than awkward. It felt strange, working alongside someone like this. Wyatt had spent so much of his life alone that he'd forgotten what it was like to have a partner, even a temporary one. By the time full dark had fallen, the cabin was warm and the stew was bubbling over the fire, filling the small space with a smell that made Wyatt's stomach remind him it had been hours since breakfast. They ate straight from the pot, passing it back and forth, too hungry and too practical to bother with plates. The stew was everything Mara had promised. Not fancy, but rich and warming, with the kind of depth of flavor that came from knowing exactly how long to let things simmer and when to add the salt. "You could charge money for this," Wyatt said. "I did charge money for it. That was the whole point of working at the Grand Hotel." Mara wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "People paid good money to eat my food. Best business the hotel restaurant had ever seen. And they still let you go. Turns out being good at your job doesn't matter if you don't look the way people think you should look." She stared into the fire, her expression hard. "The owner's wife was the one who pushed for it. Said I made the other staff look bad just by standing next to them. Said customers didn't want to see someone like me when they were trying to have a refined dining experience." Wyatt wanted to say something comforting, something that would make it better, but he knew from experience that there weren't words for that kind of hurt. So instead he just said, "Their loss." "Damn right it's their loss." She grabbed the pot and took another helping of stew. "Bozeman won't make the same mistake. I'll make sure of it." "How?" "By being so good they can't afford to say no. By making food so incredible that people talk about it in 3 states. By proving that what I look like has nothing to do with what I can do." She met his eyes. "I'm done apologizing for taking up space. I'm done making myself small so other people feel comfortable. If they've got a problem with me, that's their problem, not mine." There was something almost ferocious in the way she said it, a determination that went bone deep, that had been forged in the fires of rejection and refusal, and had come out the other side harder and sharper than before. Wyatt respected the hell out of it. "Bozeman's lucky to have you coming," he said. "Bozeman doesn't know what's coming." She smiled, and for the first time since he'd met her, it was a real smile, not guarded, not defensive, just genuine. "But they're going to find out." They finished the stew in companionable silence, then cleaned the pot with snow and banked the fire for the night. Wyatt rolled out his bedroll on the floor while Mara claimed the cot, both of them too tired for much conversation. Just before he drifted off, Wyatt heard her voice from the darkness. "Boone? Yeah? You're not half bad for a lawman. You're not half bad for someone who threatened me with a ladle." She huffed out a laugh. Good night. Good night. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows of the cabin. But inside it was warm, and for the first time in longer than Wyatt could remember, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be, even if he had no idea where that would lead. The storm caught them on the fourth day. They'd made good time since leaving the cabin, covering ground faster than Wyatt had expected. Mara set a pace that would have broken lesser travelers, but she also knew when to rest, when to push, when to take the long way around a difficult pass rather than forcing through it. She read the land like some people read books, with an understanding that went beyond simple observation into something closer to instinct. Wyatt had stopped questioning her decisions by the second day. Every time he thought she was taking them the wrong way, she'd prove him wrong within the hour. A shortcut through a narrow canyon that saved them half a day. A spot to camp that was sheltered from wind he hadn't even felt yet, but that hit them full force an hour after they'd settled in. A route around what looked like solid ground, but that she insisted was a snow-covered bog that would have swallowed the horses up to their bellies. She was right, every time. It was humbling in a way Wyatt wasn't entirely comfortable with. He'd built a reputation on being the man who knew what he was doing, who could handle whatever the wilderness threw at him. Turned out he'd been getting by on luck and stubbornness more than actual skill. Mara was the real thing. The morning of the fourth day started off deceptively calm. Clear sky, light wind, temperatures cold but not brutal. They'd broken camp early and were making their way down a long valley that Mara said would lead them to the foothills above Bozeman within 2 days. Weather's gonna turn, she said around mid-morning, pulling Bear to a stop and staring at the northwestern horizon. Wyatt looked. Saw nothing but blue sky and distant peaks. How do you know? The birds. You notice how quiet it's been the last hour? Now that she mentioned it, he had. The ravens that had been following them on and off for days were gone. So were the chickadees that usually chattered in the pine branches. They know something's coming, Mara continued. Also, the light's wrong. See how flat everything looks? Like there's no depth to it? Wyatt looked again. She was right. The landscape had taken on a strange two-dimensional quality, like a painting instead of reality. That means there's a pressure change, Mara said. Big one. We've got maybe 3 hours before it hits, maybe less. What do you want to do? Find shelter. Fast. She scanned the valley, her eyes moving with the kind of systematic precision Wyatt associated with military scouts. There, see that rock formation about 2 miles ahead? Looks like there might be an overhang. Might be? Won't know until we get there, but it's our best option unless you see something better. Wyatt didn't see anything better. Lead on. They pushed the horses harder than they had since leaving the cabin, moving at a trot that ate up ground but didn't exhaust the animals. Mara kept glancing at the horizon, her jaw tight, her shoulders set in a way that told Wyatt she was more worried than she was letting on. The wind picked up when they were still a mile from the rock formation. Not gradual, sudden, like someone had opened a door. It came from the northwest, carrying the smell of snow and cold, so sharp it felt like breathing broken glass. Come on, Mara urged Bear forward. Come on, boy. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in as many minutes. Wyatt's face went numb. His fingers, even inside his gloves, started to ache with the kind of cold that meant frostbite wasn't far behind. The first snowflakes hit when they were half a mile out. Big wet ones that stuck to everything they touched and melted into freezing slush. Within minutes, it had shifted to smaller, harder pellets that stung like buckshot when they hit exposed skin. There! Mara pointed to a dark shadow in the rock face. That's got to be it! She kicked Bear into a gallop. Wyatt followed, leaning low over Ash's neck as the wind tried to push them sideways. The snow was coming down so thick now he could barely see Mara 20 feet ahead of him, just a dark shape moving through a world that had turned uniformly white. The overhang appeared out of the storm like a miracle. Not deep, maybe 15 feet, but enough to cut the wind and keep the worst of the snow off them. Mara was already dismounting when Wyatt arrived, her movements jerky with cold and urgency. Get the horses as far back as you can, she shouted over the wind. We need to set up some kind of windbreak, or we're going to freeze. There were loose rocks scattered around the overhang, not big enough to build a proper wall, but enough to create a barrier that would deflect some of the wind. They worked in tandem, Wyatt hauling rocks while Mara positioned them, building a rough semicircle around the front of the overhang that came up to about knee height. It wasn't much, but it helped. By the time they finished, the storm had reached full fury. The wind screamed through the valley with a sound like nothing Wyatt had ever heard, part shriek, part roar, wholly inhuman. The snow came down so thick it formed a solid white wall 10 feet beyond the overhang. Visibility dropped to nothing. Mara had been right about the 3 hours. They'd made it with maybe 20 minutes to spare. "We're stuck here until it passes," she said, her breath coming in short puffs of white vapor. "Could be hours. Could be days. How's our supply situation?" "We've got food for a week if we're careful. Water's not a problem. We've got plenty of snow. Firewood's the issue. There's not much under here, and I'm not going out in that to find more." She gestured to the storm raging beyond their shelter. Wyatt had to agree with her assessment. Going out in that would be suicide. "We make do with what we have," he said. They gathered what burnable material they could find. Some dead branches wedged in the rock, dried grass poking through the snow, a few pieces of old timber that looked like they might have been part of a structure at some point. Not much, but enough for a small fire if they were smart about it. Mara got it going with the kind of efficiency that Wyatt had come to expect from her. Small flames, carefully tended, putting out more heat than seemed possible from such a modest blaze. They sat close to it, shoulders almost touching, sharing warmth while the horses huddled behind them and the storm did its best to tear the world apart. "You ever been stuck in weather like this before?" Wyatt asked. "Once, when I was a kid. My father and I were out checking trap lines when a blizzard hit. We spent 3 days in a cave eating jerky and telling each other stories to pass the time." She held her hands toward the fire, flexing her fingers. "He told me that weather like this is the world reminding us we're not actually in charge, that nature doesn't care about our plans or our pride or how tough we think we are." Sounds like a smart man. "He was. Didn't stop him from dying young." She said it matter of fact, but Wyatt heard the old pain underneath. "Pneumonia, 3 years after that storm, caught it on a warm day in April when he went out without his coat because he thought winter was over. Turned out winter had one more hand to play." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. He lived the way he wanted to live. Can't ask for much more than that." She pulled a piece of jerky from her pack and tore off a strip with her teeth. "What about you? You lose anyone?" "Everyone loses someone eventually." "That's not an answer." Wyatt was quiet for a moment, watching the fire dance. "My brother. 5 years ago. He was running from some men he'd crossed in a business deal that went bad. Asked me to help him hide. I said no, said he'd made his bed and he could lie in it." "What happened?" "They found him anyway. Beat him to death in an alley in Denver and left him for the dogs." The words came out flat, emotionless, because that was the only way Wyatt could say them without breaking. "I found out 3 days later. By the time I got there, he'd already been buried in a pauper's grave." Mara didn't say she was sorry, didn't offer empty platitudes about how it wasn't his fault or how he couldn't have known. She just sat with him in the silence, letting him have his grief without trying to fix it. After a while, she said, "That why you became a lawman? Trying to balance the scales?" "Maybe. Or maybe I just didn't want to be the kind of man who says no when someone asks for help." He picked up a small stick and tossed it into the fire. "Hasn't worked out the way I thought it would. Turns out you can't save everyone, no matter how hard you try." "No, you can't." She pulled her coat tighter. "But you can save some people, and sometimes that has to be enough." The wind shifted, sending a blast of snow through the gap in their rock wall. Mara cursed and moved to adjust the barrier, wedging more stones into place until the flow of snow reduced to a trickle. "Tell me about Bozeman," Wyatt said when she settled back down. "What's the plan when we get there?" "Find work, save money, open my own place eventually." She said it with the kind of certainty most people reserved for describing what they'd eaten for breakfast. "I'm not doing the hotel thing again, not working for someone who can fire me because they don't like the way I look or because some customer complained that I made them uncomfortable just by existing." "Your own restaurant?" "Eventually. For now, I'll take what I can get. Line cook, prep work, whatever. I just need to get my foot in the door." She stared into the fire. "There's a new hotel going up, the Northern Star. I heard they're looking for kitchen staff. If I can get hired there, prove what I can do, build a reputation, then maybe in a year or two I'll have enough saved to strike out on my own." "What kind of place do you want?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. She looked at him with something like surprise, as if nobody had ever asked her that before. "Something small," she said finally. "Not fancy. Just a place where people can come and get a good meal without having to put on airs or pretend to be something they're not. The kind of place where a ranch hand can sit next to a banker and they're both eating the same food and both being treated like they matter." Sounds ambitious. Sounds impossible, you mean? I didn't say that. You were thinking it, but there was no heat in her words. Everyone thinks it. A woman my size opening her own restaurant, running her own business, making her own decisions about how things should be done? That's not how the world works. Maybe it should be. Maybe. But should doesn't pay the bills or put food on the table. She pulled out her knife and started sharpening it against a whetstone she'd produced from somewhere in her pack. I'm not naive. I know what I'm up against. I know there are going to be people who take one look at me and decide I'm not worth their time, who will make assumptions about what I can or can't do based on nothing but their own prejudices. The sound of steel on stone filled the small space, rhythmic and almost meditative. But here's what I also know, Mara continued. I'm better at this than 99% of the people I'm competing against. I work harder, I care more, and I'm done letting other people's limitations become my limitations. She tested the edge of the knife with her thumb. So yeah, it's ambitious, and yeah, it might be impossible, but I'm going to do it anyway. Wyatt believed her. Looking at her sitting there in the firelight, her jaw set and her eyes fierce, he believed she could do anything she set her mind to. When you open that place, he said, I want to be there for the first meal. You planning on sticking around Bozeman? Might be. Haven't really thought that far ahead. What happened to tracking down outlaws and making the world a safer place? That's still the plan. Bozeman's growing fast. Probably needs someone to help keep the peace. Figured I could do that as well as anywhere else. Mara gave him a long look. This have anything to do with wanting to see how my story turns out? Maybe. Well, she slipped the knife back into its sheath. At least you're honest about it. The storm howled outside their shelter, the wind reaching a pitch that made the horses shift nervously. Wyatt stood and went to check on them, running his hands over their flanks and speaking soft reassurances that probably did more to calm him than them. Ash nuzzled his shoulder, her breath warm against his neck. Bear stood solid and patient, living up to his name. They'd be fine as long as the storm didn't last too long. When Wyatt returned to the fire, Mara had pulled out the remains of their food stores and was doing inventory. We're in decent shape, she said. Beans, rice, some dried meat, a little flour. I can make it stretch if I need to. How long do you think we're stuck here? Storm like this? Could blow through in a few hours, could settle in for days. No way to know. She started dividing the food into portions. We'll assume worst case and ration accordingly. Better to have extra than to run out. They ate a sparse meal. Beans cooked over the small fire, seasoned with just enough salt to make them palatable. Nothing like the elaborate dishes Mara had prepared before, but still better than anything Wyatt could have managed on his own. After they ate, there wasn't much to do except wait. The light outside had taken on that strange gray quality that came with heavy snow. Not quite day, not quite night, just a uniform dimness that made time feel meaningless. Mara pulled out a worn deck of cards from her pack. You play? Depends on the game. 5-card draw? I can manage that. They played for pebbles since neither of them had money to spare. Sitting cross-legged by the fire while the storm raged and the temperature dropped, and the world outside became increasingly hostile. Mara was good. Not just good, excellent. She had a poker face that would have made professional gamblers weep, and a way of reading tells that suggested she'd spent a lot of time in card houses. Where'd you learn to play like that? Wyatt asked, after she'd cleaned him out for the third hand in a row. My mother. She used to play in the mining camps when I was a kid. Said it was the only way a woman could make honest money in a place like that, taking it from men who assumed she didn't know what she was doing. Mara shuffled the deck with practiced ease. She taught me everything, how to read a bluff, how to manage my bankroll, how to walk away when the table turned against me. She's still around? No, died when I was 16, cholera outbreak in the camp where we were living. She dealt another hand. After that, it was just me and my father, then just me. That's young to be on your own. Wasn't a choice. World doesn't stop just because you're not ready for it. She studied her cards. I bet 3 pebbles. Wyatt looked at his hand, a pair of 6s and nothing else worth mentioning. He should fold. But there was something about the way Mara was sitting, something in the set of her shoulders that suggested she was bluffing. I call. She laid down her cards with a slight smile. 3 queens. Damn, Wyatt muttered. You're getting better at reading me, Mara said, gathering up the pebbles. That's the first time you've called instead of folded, but you're still not quite there. They played until the light outside had faded completely, and the fire had burned down to coals. The storm showed no signs of letting up. If anything, it had intensified, the wind screaming through the valley like something alive and angry. Wyatt added the last of their firewood to the coals, nursing them back into small flames that provided more psychological comfort than actual heat. We should try to sleep, Mara said, already rolling out her bedroll as close to the fire as she could without actually lying in it. Body heat conservation and all that. Makes sense. Wyatt spread his bedroll next to hers, not touching, but close enough that they could share warmth. It was practical, nothing more. They lay there in the darkness, listening to the storm and the horses and the crackle of the dying fire. Boone? Yeah? You really planning to stick around Bozeman, or are you just being polite? Wyatt thought about that, thought about what he had been doing for the past 5 years, drifting from town to town, chasing men who mostly weren't worth chasing, trying to outrun a guilt that followed him like a shadow. Thought about what it might be like to actually stay somewhere, to put down roots, to be part of something instead of always standing outside looking in. I don't know, he said honestly, but I'm thinking about it. Good. Thinking about it is the first step. What's the second step? Actually doing it. She shifted in her bedroll. Most people get stuck on step 1 forever. They think and they plan and they convince themselves they'll do it someday. Then someday never comes and they wake up old and full of regrets. That's speaking from experience? No. That's speaking from watching it happen to other people and deciding I wasn't going to let it happen to me. She pulled her blanket tighter. When I decided to leave Billings, I gave myself 3 days. 3 days to get my supplies together, tie up loose ends, and hit the trail. Any longer than that, and I knew I'd start finding excuses to stay. That's brave. That's survival. Brave is what you call it when you've got other options. When you don't have options, it's just what you do. The wind rattled the rocks in their makeshift wall. Snow drifted through the gaps, forming small piles that melted near the fire and stayed frozen everywhere else. You ever scared? Wyatt asked. Of what you're trying to do? Mara was quiet for so long he thought she'd fallen asleep. Then, every day, every single day I wake up scared that I'm not good enough, that I'm fooling myself, that I'm going to fail and prove everyone right who said I couldn't do it. Her voice was soft but steady. But being scared doesn't change what needs to be done. So I get up anyway. I keep going anyway. And I figure if I fail, at least I'll fail trying instead of fail by never having the guts to start. Wyatt understood that. Understood it better than he'd understood most things in his life. Thanks, he said. For what? For letting me come along. For not telling me to get lost when I stumbled into your camp half dead. You're welcome. Thanks for not being an asshole about it. We've already had this conversation. I know, but it bears repeating. She yawned. Get some sleep, Boone. Tomorrow's going to be another long day, assuming this storm ever ends. Wyatt closed his eyes and listened to the wind, to Mara's breathing evening out as she drifted toward sleep, to the horses shifting behind them. He thought about Bozeman, about what it might be like to have a place to go instead of just places to leave, about watching Mara build her dream from the ground up and maybe, possibly, being part of it in some small way. It was a strange thought, not entirely comfortable, but not unwelcome either. He fell asleep thinking about it, and when he dreamed of a restaurant that didn't exist yet but might, if the world was willing to make space for people who refused to stay small. The storm lasted 2 days. 2 days of being trapped under a rock overhang with nothing to do except play cards, tell stories, and try not to think about how cold it was. They rationed their food carefully, made the firewood last by banking it overnight and only building up the flames when the cold became truly unbearable. Wyatt learned things about Mara in those 2 days. Learned that she could recite poetry from memory. Not the flowery romantic stuff, but the rough frontier ballads about cowboys and outlaws and women who refused to be tamed. Learned that she had a scar on her left forearm from a kitchen accident when she was learning to cook, a burn from a pan that had tipped over and marked her for life. Learned that she snored, just a little, and that she talked in her sleep sometimes, fragments of conversations with people who weren't there. Learned that despite her tough exterior, she was still fundamentally kind, checking on the horses even when it meant braving the wind, dividing the food so that Wyatt got slightly larger portions even though she was doing just as much work, keeping the fire going through the night so he could sleep without worrying about freezing. On the morning of the third day, Wyatt woke to silence. Not the kind of silence that came from being buried under snow, but the kind that came from the absence of wind. He sat up carefully, trying not to wake Mara, and looked out beyond their shelter. The storm had passed. The world outside was transformed, buried under at least 3 feet of fresh snow, the landscape smoothed into soft curves that hid all the rough edges underneath. The sky was clear, that particular shade of blue that only came after a big storm, and the sun was just starting to rise over the eastern peaks, painting everything in shades of pink and gold. It was beautiful. Heartbreakingly, impossibly beautiful. "About time," Mara said from behind him, her voice rough with sleep. "I was starting to think we'd be stuck here until spring. How long until we can move? Give it a few hours for the sun to soften the snow a bit. Then we'll see what's possible." She stood and stretched, her joints popping audibly. "Check the horses. I'll see what I can do about breakfast." The horses were fine, hungry, restless from being cooped up, but unharmed. Wyatt led them out of the overhang, one at a time, letting them move around in the snow, get their blood flowing again. Breakfast was the last of their beans mixed with some of the flour to make a kind of rough porridge that filled the stomach without doing much for the spirit. They ate it quickly, efficiently, both of them eager to get moving again. Breaking camp took longer than usual. Everything was either frozen or buried, and they had to dig out half their gear from snowdrifts. But by mid-morning, they were packed and ready, the horses saddled, their breath making white clouds in the cold air. "Trail's going to be rough," Mara said, studying the snow-covered valley ahead of them. "We'll have to take it slow, let the horses pick their way through, but we should make decent time if the weather holds." "How far to Bozeman?" 2 days if we're lucky, 3 if we're not." They mounted up and started forward, the horses breaking through the snow with each step, their progress measured and deliberate. It was slow work, exhausting work, but it was progress. The valley opened up ahead of them, the mountains falling away to reveal rolling foothills that would eventually give way to the flatter land around Bozeman. Wyatt could almost see it in his mind. The town itself. Buildings rising from the plain, smoke from chimneys, the promise of walls and roofs and civilization. They rode through the afternoon without much conversation, saving their energy for the work of moving through deep snow. By the time they stopped to make camp that night, both of them were exhausted. But they were also closer. Closer to Bozeman, closer to whatever came next, closer to the dividing line between the life they'd been living and the life they might live, if they had the courage to reach for it. Mara made a fire and cooked the last of their supplies. A thin soup that was more water than substance, but hot and filling enough to matter. They ate it sitting close to the flames, neither of them speaking, both of them lost in their own thoughts. "Tomorrow we should hit the main road," Mara said finally. "From there it's a straight shot into town. We'll be there by nightfall, if we push." "You nervous?" "Terrified." She said it so matter-of-factly that Wyatt almost laughed. "This is it, you know. This is the moment where I either prove I can do what I said I'd do, or I fail and have to figure out what comes after failure. You won't fail. You don't know that. I know you, that's enough." She looked at him across the fire, her expression unreadable. "You barely know me, Boone. We've been traveling together less than a week. Doesn't matter. Some people you know in 5 minutes. Some people you could know for 5 years and still not really know them at all." He poked at the fire with a stick. "You're the first kind." "What does that mean?" "It means I trust you. It means I believe you when you say you're going to do something. It means I think Bozeman's going to be better for having you in it." Mara was quiet for a long moment. Then she said very softly, "Thanks." "You already thanked me." "I know, but it bears repeating. They sat there until the fire died down and the cold started to seep in, neither of them quite ready to acknowledge that this was almost over, this strange partnership they'd formed, this temporary alliance that had somehow become something more than convenience. Tomorrow, they'd reach Bozeman. Tomorrow, Mara would start her new life, and Wyatt would have to decide whether he was staying or leaving. But tonight, they still had the fire and the stars, and the comfortable silence of two people who understood each other without needing to explain why. That would have to be enough. They reached Bozeman just as the sun was starting its descent behind the mountains, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple that looked almost too vivid to be real. The town sprawled across the valley floor like something that had grown organically rather than been planned. Buildings of varying heights and states of repair, streets that followed the contours of the land instead of any grid pattern, smoke rising from what must have been dozens of chimneys. It was bigger than Wyatt had expected, more permanent, less frontier outpost and more actual town, with the kind of infrastructure that suggested people thought they'd be here for a while. Mara pulled Bear to a stop on the ridge overlooking the valley and just stared. Wyatt stopped beside her, giving her the moment. "Looks different than I remembered," she said quietly. "More built up. More real. When were you here last?" 2 years ago, passing through. It was half this size then, maybe less." She pointed to a large building near the center of town that looked new, its wood still pale and unseasoned. "That must be the Northern Star, the hotel I told you about." Even from a distance, Wyatt could see it was impressive, 3 stories tall with a wide front porch and windows that caught the dying light. The kind of place that would attract the newly wealthy, the people with gold money burning holes in their pockets. The kind of place that would have high standards and even higher expectations. "You ready?" he asked. Mara took a breath, let it out slowly. "No, but I'm doing it anyway." They rode down into town as the street lamps were being lit, their arrival noted by the handful of people still out and about, shopkeepers closing up for the night, a few cowboys heading toward what was probably a saloon, a woman in a fine dress hurrying somewhere with her head down against the cold. Nobody gave them more than a passing glance. Just 2 more travelers among the hundreds who must pass through Bozeman every week. Mara led them to a livery stable on the edge of town, a solid building that smelled of hay and horse and honest work. The owner was a grizzled man in his 60s who looked them over with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen every type of traveler there was. "Need boarding for 2 horses," Mara said, "and information, if you're selling it. Information's free if the question's reasonable. Boarding's 2 bits a night per horse, includes feed and water." The man spat tobacco juice into a bucket with impressive accuracy. "What do you want to know?" "The Northern Star Hotel. They hiring kitchen staff?" "Might be. Head chef quit about a week ago, took half the staff with him when he went. Something about creative differences with the owner." The man grinned, showing more gaps than teeth. "Which means they're probably desperate enough to hire anyone who knows which end of a knife to hold." Mara's expression didn't change, but Wyatt saw her hands tighten on Bear's reins. "Where would I apply?" "Front desk, I'd imagine. Talk to a woman named Mrs. Patterson. She's the day manager, handles all the hiring." He took the reins from Mara and started leading the horses toward stalls. "Word of advice, though, she's particular about appearances. Likes things neat and proper. You might want to clean up a bit before you go see her." "Noted," Mara said, her voice carefully neutral. They paid the stable fee and collected their saddlebags, then stood in the street as full darkness settled over the town and the temperature dropped another 10 degrees. "I need to find a boarding house," Mara said, "somewhere cheap until I get work." "There's a place called Sullivan's on 3rd Street, the stable owner called from inside. "Run by a widow woman. Clean, quiet, doesn't ask too many questions. Tell her Garrett sent you." "Appreciated." But they found Sullivan's without much trouble, a narrow 2-story building sandwiched between a dry goods store and a tailor's shop. The widow Sullivan turned out to be a practical woman in her 50s who took one look at them and quoted a price that was almost reasonable. "2 rooms or 1?" she asked. "2," Mara said before Wyatt could answer. $1 a week each, paid in advance. Breakfast included, other meals you're on your own. No drinking, no gambling, no guests after 9 o'clock. You break something, you pay for it. You cause trouble, you're out. We clear? Clear, Mara said, counting out coins from a small leather pouch. Wyatt paid his own way, and Mrs. Sullivan led them upstairs to 2 rooms at the end of a narrow hallway. They were small, barely big enough for a bed, a washstand, and a chair. But they were clean, and the beds looked like they'd been made sometime this decade. Bathrooms downstairs shared between everyone on this floor, Mrs. Sullivan said. You want hot water for a bath? You heat it yourself. Breakfast is at 7 sharp. Miss it, and you don't eat. After she left, Wyatt knocked on the wall between his room and Mara's. 2 knocks back told him she'd heard. He sat on the edge of the bed and tried to figure out what came next. He'd gotten Mara to Bozeman like he'd said he would. His obligation, such as it was, had been fulfilled. He could collect his horse in the morning and ride out, head back to whatever passed for his life before this. But the thought of leaving felt wrong in a way he couldn't quite articulate. There was another knock on his door. When he opened it, Mara was standing there with her hair loose for the first time since he'd known her, falling past her shoulders in dark waves that made her look younger, softer. I'm going to go look at the Northern Star, she said. Just look, not apply. Not tonight. I just want to see it up close. Want company? Yeah, I think I do. They walked through the darkening streets, past buildings that ranged from new construction to structures that looked like they'd been standing since before Montana was even a territory. Bozeman had that frontier mix of permanence and impermanence. Some people building like they'd be here forever, others throwing up structures that wouldn't last a winter. The Northern Star dominated its block, lights blazing from every window, the sound of music and conversation spilling out into the street. Through the large front windows, Wyatt could see a dining room filled with well-dressed people eating what looked like an elaborate meal. Mara stopped across the street and just stared, her expression unreadable. That's where you want to work? Wyatt asked. That's where I'm going to work, at least for a while. She watched a waiter move through the dining room with practiced grace, balancing plates like they weighed nothing. I need to see what they're doing, what level they're operating at. How can you tell from here? Watch. She pointed to a table near the window where a couple was being served what looked like roast duck. See how the waiter's presenting it? Showing them the whole bird before he carves? That's French service. Very formal. Very precise. Means whoever's cooking back there knows what they're doing, or at least knows what's expected in a high-end establishment. Wyatt wouldn't have noticed any of that. To him, it just looked like rich people eating expensive food. Can you cook like that? He asked. Better. There was no arrogance in the way she said it, just statement of fact. But I need to prove it, and that's going to be the hard part. They stood there for another few minutes, watching the theater of it all, the servers moving like dancers, the kitchen doors swinging open and closed, brief glimpses of controlled chaos beyond. Then Mara turned away. I've seen enough. Let's get back before Sullivan locks us out. The walk back was quieter, both of them lost in their own thoughts. When they reached the boarding house, Mara stopped with her hand on the doorknob. Tomorrow, I'm going to apply, she said. Early, before the breakfast rush. Catch them when they're desperate. Good strategy. Will you still be here when I get back? It was the question Wyatt had been avoiding all day. The question he still didn't have a good answer for. I don't know, he said honestly. I should probably check in with the local law, see if they need help. Figure out if there's work for me here or if I should move on. That's not what I asked. I know. Mara looked at him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face for something he wasn't sure he had to give. Then she nodded, once, sharp. Fine. Do what you need to do. I'll do what I need to do. If we're both still here tomorrow night, we'll compare notes. Sounds like a plan. She went inside without another word. Wyatt stood in the street for a few minutes more, looking up at the stars barely visible through the light pollution from the town, trying to figure out when exactly he'd started caring about whether he stayed or left. He didn't have an answer for that either. Morning came too early and too cold. Wyatt woke to weak sunlight filtering through thin curtains and the sound of people moving around downstairs. He dressed quickly, splashed water on his face from the basin, and made it to breakfast with minutes to spare. The dining room was crowded. A dozen other boarders, all men, all eating with the focused intensity of people who knew this might be their only guaranteed meal of the day. Mrs. Sullivan presided over the room from a position near the kitchen door, making sure everyone got their share and no one took more than that. Mara wasn't there. "Your friend left an hour ago," Mrs. Sullivan said, appearing at Wyatt's elbow with a plate of eggs and toast. "Said she had business to attend to." "She say when she'd be back?" "Didn't ask. Not my business to track my boarders' comings and goings long as they pay on time and don't cause trouble." Wyatt ate mechanically, barely tasting the food. When he finished, he headed out into a town that looked different in daylight, less romantic, more utilitarian. The streets were already busy with people going about their business, wagons hauling goods, men heading to jobs, the occasional woman hurrying along with a basket or a child in tow. The sheriff's office was easy to find, a squat building near the center of town with bars on the windows and a sign that had seen better days. Wyatt pushed through the door into a room that smelled of coffee and old tobacco smoke. A man looked up from behind a desk cluttered with paperwork. He was maybe 50, with gray hair and eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything. "Help you?" he asked. "Name's Wyatt Boone. Used to do law work down in Billings. Thought I'd check in, see if you needed an extra hand." The sheriff, his badge said his name was Morrison, looked Wyatt over with the kind of thorough assessment that came from years of judging character quickly and accurately. "You got papers? References?" Wyatt pulled out the battered letter of reference from his former employer and handed it over. Morrison read it slowly, his expression giving nothing away. "Says here you're good at tracking, good with a gun, good at keeping your head in bad situations." He set the letter down. "Also says you left Billings 3 months ago with no forwarding address. That strike you as the kind of thing that looks good on a reference?" "No, sir." "Why'd you leave?" Wyatt had known this question was coming, had prepared an answer that was true enough without being the whole truth. "Got tired of chasing the same problems in circles. Thought a change of scenery might do me good." "And now you want to chase different problems in different circles?" "Something like that." Morrison leaned back in his chair, which creaked ominously under his weight. "I don't need a deputy. Already got 2, and that's more than enough for a town this size. What I could use is someone to handle the drunk and disorderly, keep an eye on the gambling houses, maybe break up fights before they turn into something worse. It's not glamorous work. Mostly it's boring. But when it's not boring, it gets ugly fast." "I can handle ugly." "I'm sure you can. Question is whether you can handle boring without getting yourself into trouble just to feel useful." Morrison pulled out a different form from his desk drawer. "I'll give you a trial run. 2 weeks, paid daily. If it works out, we'll talk about something more permanent. If it doesn't, we part ways with no hard feelings. Fair enough. You carry a gun, you register it with me. You pull that gun in my town, you better have a damn good reason. You start any trouble, you're done. We clear?" "Clear." Morrison pushed the form across the desk. "Fill this out. Report here tomorrow morning at 8. I'll have Carter, he's one of my deputies, show you the ropes." Wyatt filled out the form, using Mrs. Sullivan's boarding house as his address, and left feeling like he'd just committed to something without fully thinking it through, which, he supposed, he had. It was almost noon by the time he made it back to the boarding house. Mara still wasn't there. He spent the afternoon walking the town, getting a feel for the layout, noting which streets felt safe and which ones had that edge that said trouble happened here regularly. Bozeman was growing fast. He could see it in the half-finished buildings, the surveyor's stakes marking out new lots, the constant traffic of wagons bringing in supplies. Growing towns meant opportunity. They also meant the kind of chaos that came when civilization and frontier tried to exist in the same space. Morrison had been right. There would be plenty of work for someone willing to stand between those two forces and try to keep them from tearing each other apart. As the sun started to set, Wyatt found himself back at the boarding house, pacing in his small room and trying not to watch the street for Mara's return. When she finally walked through the door just after dark, he heard her footsteps on the stairs and was in the hallway before she reached her room. She looked exhausted. Her hair had come loose from its braid and her face was flushed, but there was something in her eyes, something that might have been triumph or might have been shock. "Well?" Wyatt asked. Mara leaned against the wall and let out a breath that was half laugh, half something else entirely. "I got a trial." "A trial? Not a job. A trial, one night, tomorrow night." She pushed her hair back from her face with a hand that wasn't quite steady. Mrs. Patterson said they'd had 30 people apply since their chef quit. 30. Most of them didn't even make it past the interview. The ones that did got sent away because they couldn't prove they knew what they were doing. So how'd you get a trial? I told her I'd cook her lunch. Right there, in the hotel kitchen, with whatever ingredients they had on hand. No prep time, no special requests, just me and a stove and 30 minutes. Mara's eyes were bright. She said yes, probably just to get rid of me. So I went into that kitchen and made her a meal that shut her up so completely she forgot to chew for a full minute. What'd you make? Trout almondine with roasted vegetables and a lemon butter sauce. They had fresh trout in their cold storage, probably from the creek that runs through town. The vegetables were sad and wilted, but I worked with what I had. The sauce I made from scratch. She smiled, and it was the first real smile Wyatt had seen on her face since they'd arrived. She ate every bite, didn't say a word until her plate was empty. Then she told me I had one night to prove I could handle the dinner service. That's incredible. That's terrifying. The smile faded. One night, Boone, one shot to prove I belong there. If I fail, I'm done. She made that very clear. She's got 3 other people waiting who could start immediately. The only reason she's giving me a chance at all is because that trout was apparently the best thing she's eaten since the hotel opened. You won't fail. You keep saying that like you know something I don't. I know you. That's enough. Mara closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again, they were bright with something that might have been tears but might have just been exhaustion. I need to prep. She said I could come in early tomorrow, get familiar with the kitchen, the equipment, the supplies. The dinner service starts at 6. I need to be ready to handle everything that comes through those doors. What can I do? Nothing. This is my fight. She straightened up, squaring her shoulders. But thank you for asking. She went into her room and closed the door, leaving Wyatt standing in the hallway feeling useless and worried in equal measure. He lay awake most of the night, listening to the sounds of Mara moving around in the next room, pacing, muttering to herself, the scratch of pencil on paper that meant she was planning, strategizing, preparing for battle. Because that's what it was, really. A battle. Not with weapons or fists, but with food and fire and the sheer force of will required to prove herself to people who'd already decided what she was worth based on nothing but how she looked. Wyatt had been in plenty of actual battles, had the scars to prove it, but he wasn't sure he'd ever faced anything as difficult as what Mara was about to do. When morning came, she was already gone. Wyatt reported to the sheriff's office and spent the day learning the rhythms of Bozeman law enforcement from Deputy Carter, a lean man in his 30s who treated the job with the kind of casual competence that came from years of experience. They broke up 2 fights, both of them in saloons, both of them over nothing worth fighting about. They hauled a drunk out of the street before he got himself run over by a freight wagon. They talked down a miner who was convinced someone had stolen his gold claim, when in reality, he'd just forgotten where he'd filed the paperwork. It was exactly the kind of boring, necessary work Morrison had described, and Wyatt found, to his surprise, that he didn't mind it. As 6 o'clock approached, he made his excuses to Carter and headed for the Northern Star. The hotel was already busy, well-dressed people streaming through the front doors, the sound of conversation and laughter spilling out into the street. Wyatt had no intention of going inside. He couldn't afford a meal there even if he'd wanted to, and besides, he'd be more distraction than help. But he couldn't stay away either. He found a spot across the street where he could see through the front windows without being too obvious about it. Watched the dining room fill with people, watched the servers move through the space with choreographed precision. Somewhere in the back, in a kitchen he couldn't see, Mara was fighting the battle of her life. The first hour passed without incident. Plates came out of the kitchen with mechanical regularity. Servers delivered them with practiced smiles. Customers ate and talked and seemed happy enough. Then something changed. Wyatt couldn't see what exactly, but he felt it. A shift in the energy of the room, a ripple of reaction that moved through the diners like wind through grass. A woman at a table near the window put down her fork and just stared at her plate. Her companion said something. She didn't respond. He tried her food, and his expression changed too. Surprise, then something that looked almost like wonder. It spread from table to table, that same reaction. People slowing down their eating, paying attention to what was on their plates instead of treating it as fuel or social obligation. Conversations pausing. the whole room shifting from background noise to focused attention. Whatever Mara was sending out of that kitchen, it was landing like a punch to the chest. Wyatt watched a man in an expensive suit summon a server, say something that made the server hurry toward the kitchen. A minute later, Mrs. Patterson herself appeared in the dining room, moving from table to table with an expression that Wyatt couldn't quite read from this distance. More servers appeared carrying additional plates, things that hadn't been on the menu, Wyatt guessed. Samples, perhaps? Or Mara showing off, proving she could do more than just execute someone else's recipes. The dining room stayed full past 9 o'clock, past 10. People lingering over dessert, ordering coffee, clearly not wanting to leave. The kind of atmosphere that meant something special was happening, something worth staying for. Wyatt had been planning to wait until Mara came out, walk her back to the boarding house. But as the hours stretched on and the temperature dropped and his feet went numb, he realized she wasn't going to leave anytime soon. Whatever was happening in that kitchen, it was bigger than one night, bigger than a trial. It was the beginning of something. He walked back to Mrs. Sullivan's alone, climbed the stairs to his small room, and sat in the dark trying to process what he'd witnessed. Mara hadn't just passed her trial, she'd dominated it. Had taken a room full of wealthy people who probably thought they'd seen it all and made them pay attention, made them care, made them remember that food could be more than just sustenance. She'd done exactly what she said she would do, and she'd made it look easy. Wyatt was still awake when he heard footsteps on the stairs sometime after midnight, a soft knock on his door. When he opened it, Mara was standing there still in her kitchen clothes, her face streaked with sweat and what might have been a burn on her forearm, her hair a mess, her eyes blazing with an energy that seemed barely contained. "I did it," she said. "They offered me the position. Head chef, starting immediately." "I know, I watched from across the street." "You watched?" "Couldn't help myself. Wanted to see how it turned out." And you were magnificent. The whole dining room felt it. Whatever you were making back there, it hit people like they'd never eaten before in their lives. Mara leaned against the doorframe, and Wyatt saw the exhaustion beneath the triumph. Mrs. Patterson said it was the best dinner service they'd had since the hotel opened. Said people were already asking when I'd be cooking next. Said if I can maintain that quality, she'll give me free rein over the menu and the budget. That's incredible. That's terrifying. She laughed, but it was shaky. What if I can't do it again? What if tonight was a fluke? It wasn't a fluke, that was you. That's what you do. Yeah. She took a breath, steadying herself. Yeah, you're right. That's what I do. They stood there in the doorway, neither of them quite ready to acknowledge that this changed things, that the temporary partnership they'd formed on the trail had reached its natural conclusion. "You staying?" Mara asked finally. "Morrison gave me a trial run as a deputy, 2 weeks to prove myself. So we're both on trial. Looks like it." "Well?" She pushed away from the doorframe. "I should sleep. I need to be back at the hotel by 6 to prep for breakfast service." "Congratulations, Mara. Really. Thanks. For everything. For getting me here. For believing in me when I wasn't sure I believed in myself. For..." Her voice cracked slightly. "For being a good friend when I needed one." She went to her room before Wyatt could respond, the door closing softly behind her. Friend. The word sat in his chest like something too big to fit comfortably. Because that's what they were, he supposed. Friends. Partners who'd helped each other through a difficult journey and were now going their separate ways into separate lives. It should have felt right. Should have felt like the natural progression of things. Instead, it felt like something ending before it had really begun. Wyatt lay back down on his narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of Mara moving around next door, preparing for sleep that probably wouldn't come easy. Tomorrow, they'd both start their new lives. Separate lives running parallel in the same town but not really together. It was what they'd both said they wanted, so why did it feel so much like loss? 3 weeks passed before Wyatt and Mara had a real conversation again. It wasn't intentional, the distance. It was just what happened when two people got swallowed up by their new lives and forgot to make time for the friendship that had gotten them there in the first place. Wyatt's days fell into a rhythm he hadn't expected to find comfortable, but somehow did. Morning patrol with Carter, checking the gambling houses and saloons for overnight trouble. Afternoons handling whatever complaints came through the sheriff's office. Disputes over property lines, accusations of theft that usually turned out to be misunderstandings. The occasional actual crime that required investigation. Evenings walking the streets as the town came alive with miners and cowboys and businessmen all looking to spend money they'd worked too hard to earn. Morrison had been right about the boring parts. Most of what Wyatt did was tedious: paperwork, mediation, standing around looking official while people worked out their problems themselves. But when things went sideways, they went sideways fast. He'd broken up 3 knife fights, talked down 2 men with guns, and hauled more drunks to the jail cells than he could count. The town was testing him, feeling out his limits, seeing if he was the kind of lawman who'd look the other way for the right price or the right connections. Wyatt made it clear early on that he wasn't. A cattle baron's son got the same treatment as a ranch hand when it came to disturbing the peace. A shopkeeper's wife got the same attention as a saloon girl when she reported a theft. It earned him respect from some quarters and resentment from others. Morrison seemed satisfied, which was what mattered. On his 20th day in town, Morrison called him into the office and told him the trial period was over. The job was his permanently if he wanted it. Wyatt said yes before he'd fully thought it through, and then spent the rest of the day wondering when exactly he'd decided to stay in Bozeman for real. Mara's transformation was more visible. The Northern Star's reputation had spread through town like wildfire after that first night, and now people were making reservations weeks in advance just to eat her food. The dining room was packed every night, and Wyatt heard through the gossip that traveled through every frontier town that they'd had to hire additional staff just to handle the volume. He saw her sometimes, from a distance, hurrying through the streets early in the morning with a basket over her arm, heading to the butcher or the market. Late at night, walking back to Mrs. Sullivan's with her shoulders slumped and exhaustion written in every line of her body. Once he saw her through the hotel's kitchen window, visible for just a moment before the door swung shut, surrounded by steam and fire and organized chaos, completely in her element. She looked happy. Stressed, overworked, pushed to her limits, but happy in a way that went bone deep. Wyatt was glad for her. And if there was a part of him that missed their conversations by the campfire, their easy partnership on the trail, well, that was his problem to deal with. The collision happened on a Saturday night in early December, 3 weeks and 2 days after Mara's first dinner service. Wyatt was making his evening rounds when he heard shouting coming from the alley behind the Northern Star. He ran toward it, hand on his gun, and found 2 men squared off against each other while a third lay on the ground bleeding from his nose. "What's going on here, see?" Wyatt demanded, stepping between the 2 standing men before things could escalate further. "This bastard's trying to steal our jobs," one of them snarled. He was big, probably worked as a ranch hand based on his clothes, with the kind of mean drunk energy that said he was looking for a fight and didn't much care who it was with. Coming in here taking work that should go to real Americans. The man he was advancing on was smaller Asian, dressed in kitchen whites that were now splattered with what looked like soup. His expression was carefully neutral, but his hands were up in a defensive posture. "That true?" Wyatt asked the smaller man. "You work here?" "Yes, sir. I'm the new sous chef. Mrs. Holloway hired me last week." "He's lying," the drunk insisted. "Everybody knows this hotel only hires white folk. He's probably some thief trying to steal food." "Actually," a voice said from behind Wyatt, cold and sharp as a blade, "he's telling the truth. He works for me. And if you touch him again, I'll make sure you never eat anywhere in this town without worrying about what's in your food." Mara stood in the kitchen doorway, still wearing her stained apron, a large knife in one hand that she absolutely did not need for this conversation, but was apparently carrying anyway. The drunk took one look at her and laughed. "You're the head chef? That's rich. What's next? They gonna hire a woman to run the bank?" "Get out of my alley," Mara said, her voice deadly quiet. "And don't come back. You're banned from the Northern Star, permanently." "You can't ban me. You're just the cook. I'm the head chef, which means I control who eats my food and who doesn't, and you don't." She took a step forward, and something in her energy made the drunk actually take a step back. "Now get out before I decide that using this knife is worth losing my job over." Wyatt put a hand on her arm, gently pushing the knife down. "I've got this." "Do you?" She looked at him for the first time since she'd appeared, and Wyatt saw 3 weeks of exhaustion and stress and pressure finally finding an outlet. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're about to give these men a warning and send them on their way. And I'm telling you that's not good enough." "Mara, no." She pulled her arm away from his grip. "This isn't the trail, Boone. You don't get to make all the decisions here. This is my kitchen, my staff, my responsibility, and I'm not letting anyone come into my space and threaten my people. The drunk seemed to sense an opportunity in their disagreement. See? She's crazy. Probably why they hired her. Nobody else would work with her. Mara moved faster than Wyatt would have thought possible for someone her size. She had the man against the wall with the knife pressed to his throat before anyone could react, her face inches from his, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried through the alley. Say one more word about me. I dare you. See what happens. Mara, Wyatt said, more forcefully this time. Let him go. Why should I? Because if you don't, you're proving him right. You're proving that you can't control yourself, that you're too emotional, too unstable. You're giving him exactly what he wants. Her hand tightened on the knife. For a long moment, Wyatt genuinely wasn't sure what she'd do. Then she stepped back, lowering the weapon. Fine. But he's still banned. Wyatt turned to the three men, all of whom were now looking significantly more sober than they had a minute ago. Here's what's going to happen. You three are going to leave. Right now. And you're not coming back to this hotel, not coming near this alley, not bothering Miss Holloway or any of her staff. If I see you around here again, I'm arresting you for trespassing and assault. We clear? They were clear. They stumbled out of the alley without another word, the one with the bloody nose holding a handkerchief to his face. When they were gone, Mara turned to her sous chef. The man was still standing exactly where he'd been, his expression carefully blank. You all right, Lynn? Yes, chef, thank you. Go back inside. Make sure the sauces haven't burned while I was out here. Yes, chef. He disappeared into the kitchen, moving fast. Mara and Wyatt stood in the alley, facing each other, the space between them charged with something that felt like anger, but ran deeper. You didn't have to do that, Wyatt said finally. I had the situation under control. Did you? Because it looked to me like you were about to let them walk away with nothing but a warning. I was going to arrest them for assault once I got the full story. Right, after you made sure the poor white men understood they weren't in any real trouble. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. You know what your problem is, Boone. You still think the system works. You think if you just follow the rules and do everything right, justice will happen. And you don't? I think the system was built to protect people like those men and control people like me and Lynn. I think following the rules only works if the rules were designed with you in mind. She gestured at herself. I've spent my whole life following rules that were never meant to let me succeed. Staying quiet when people insulted me. Accepting less pay than I was worth. Pretending it didn't hurt when someone told me I wasn't good enough because of how I looked. So what changed? I did. I decided I was done playing by rules that were rigged against me from the start. She wiped the knife on her apron, her hands shaking slightly with leftover adrenaline. That's why I came out here with this. Not because I actually plan to use it, but because sometimes you have to show people you're willing to fight back before they'll take you seriously. Wyatt wanted to argue with her, wanted to tell her that violence wasn't the answer, that there were better ways to handle things. But he'd spent enough time in Bozeman to see how people treated Mara. The whispers behind her back, the customers who requested a different chef when they found out who was cooking, the way even Mrs. Patterson sometimes looked at her like she was a problem to be managed rather than an asset to be valued. And he'd seen how Lynn had been treated just now, 3 against 1, beaten for no reason except existing in a space someone else thought he didn't belong. Maybe Mara was right. Maybe following the rules only worked if the rules were fair to begin with. I'm sorry, he said. You're right. I should have been harder on them. I'm not looking for an apology, Boone. I'm looking for you to understand that not everyone gets to trust the system the way you do. She slid the knife into the sheath on her belt. I need to get back to work. We're in the middle of dinner service, and I've got 20 orders waiting. When do you finish? Late, probably after midnight. I'll walk you home. You don't have to do that. I know, but we haven't talked in 3 weeks, and I miss you. So I'm going to walk you home, and we're going to catch up like actual friends, instead of 2 people who pretend not to see each other on the street. Something in Mara's expression softened. Fine. But you're buying breakfast tomorrow. I've been living on kitchen scraps and coffee for 2 weeks because I'm too tired to cook for myself after work. Deal. She went back inside and Wyatt finished his rounds, but his mind wasn't on the job anymore. It was on Mara standing in that alley with a knife in her hand and fire in her eyes, defending her people with a ferocity that probably should have worried him, but instead made him respect her even more. True to his word, he was waiting outside the kitchen door when the last customers left and the cleanup began. He could hear Mara through the closed door directing her staff with the same commanding presence she brought to everything, making sure every surface was cleaned, every ingredient stored properly, every preparation made for tomorrow's service. When she finally emerged just after 1 in the morning, she looked like she'd been through a war. Her hair had escaped its braid hours ago and hung in sweaty tangles around her face. Her apron was covered in stains from a dozen different dishes. There were burns on her forearms and a cut on one hand that she'd wrapped in a bandage that was now coming loose. But her eyes were bright, alive. The eyes of someone doing exactly what they were meant to do. "Ready?" Wyatt asked. "More than ready. If I have to look at another pot tonight, I might throw it through a window." They walked through empty streets under a sky so clear the stars looked close enough to touch. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and their breath came out in white clouds, but Wyatt barely felt the cold. "How's the job going?" Mara asked. "You staying on?" "Morrison made it permanent last week." "Good. You're good at it. I hear people talking. They say you're fair, tough, but fair." "That the same people who banned from the Northern Star?" "Different people. Although those particular gentlemen have been telling everyone who will listen that I'm a crazy woman who threatened to kill them, so that's fun." She pulled her coat tighter. "Mrs. Patterson had to field 3 complaints this week from people who didn't want to eat food cooked by someone so unstable." "What'd she say?" "She told them they were welcome to eat elsewhere, but that I was the best chef in Montana and she wasn't firing me because some men couldn't handle a woman with a backbone." Mara smiled. "I might be starting to like her. She'd be stupid to fire you. The hotel's making more money than it ever has." "Money doesn't always trump prejudice, Boone. But yeah, I think I'm safe for now, as long as I keep producing results." They reached Mrs. Sullivan's and stood outside in the cold, neither of them quite ready to go in and end the conversation. "I'm sorry we haven't talked," Mara said. "I've been so consumed with the kitchen, with proving myself, with making sure every single meal is perfect because I know people are waiting for me to fail." "I get it. I've been busy too, but that's not an excuse. You're my friend. You got me here. I shouldn't have let work take over everything." She looked at him directly. "Tomorrow, breakfast, my treat. And we make it a regular thing, yeah? Once a week, we actually sit down and talk like human beings instead of ships passing in the night." "I'd like that." "Good. Because I miss you too." She smiled, tired but genuine. "Now go get some sleep. You look like hell." "Back at you." She went inside and Wyatt stood in the street for a moment longer, feeling something settle in his chest that had been restless for weeks. Tomorrow, they'd have breakfast. They'd rebuild the friendship that had gotten lost in the chaos of new jobs and new lives. It wasn't the trail, wasn't the easy partnership they'd had when survival was the only thing that mattered. But maybe it could be something better. The next morning, Wyatt met Mara at a small cafe 3 blocks from Mrs. Sullivan's, a place called Rosie's that served breakfast to miners and ranch hands and anyone else who needed hot food before dawn. It wasn't fancy, but the coffee was strong and the portions were generous. Mara was already there when Wyatt arrived, sitting in a corner booth with a cup of coffee in front of her and circles under her eyes that said she hadn't slept much. "Rough night?" Wyatt asked, sliding into the seat across from her. "Every night's rough, but I'm getting used to it." She gestured to the menu. "Order whatever you want. I'm buying, remember?" They ordered eggs and bacon and toast for Wyatt, steak and potatoes for Mara, and sat in comfortable silence while they waited for the food to arrive. "Tell me about the job," Mara said finally. "Not the official stuff, the real stuff. You liking it?" Wyatt considered the question. "Yeah, actually, I am. It's different from what I was doing before. Less chasing, more preventing. Less glory, more grunt work. But it feels like it matters in a way tracking outlaws never did." "How so?" "When you track someone down and bring them in, you're solving one problem. Maybe making one person's life a little safer. But here, doing this work, I feel like I'm helping build something. Like every fight I break up, every dispute I mediate, it's one more brick in the foundation of an actual community." He took a sip of coffee. Does that make sense? Perfect sense. That's how I feel about the kitchen. Every meal I cook, I'm not just feeding people. I'm showing them what's possible. I'm changing their expectations of what food can be, what a woman can do, what someone who looks like me is capable of. She leaned back as the server brought their plates. It's exhausting, but it matters. They ate in silence for a while, both of them too hungry to waste time on conversation. The food was good, not Northern Star quality, but solid and honest and exactly what they needed. I hired 3 more staff this week, Mara said, around a mouthful of steak. Lynn, you met. There's also Emma, who does pastries, and a kid named Thomas who's still learning but has good instincts. Mrs. Patterson gave me a bigger budget and told me to build a proper kitchen team. That's incredible. That's pressure. Now I've got people depending on me, counting on me to keep this job so they can keep theirs. If I fail, I'm not just letting myself down. She cut another piece of steak with more force than necessary. Lynn told me yesterday that this is the first job he's had where people treat him like a person instead of a curiosity. Emma said working for a woman chef is the only reason her husband lets her work at all, and Thomas is the sole support for his mother and 2 sisters. So no pressure at all. None whatsoever. She laughed, but it was strained. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd just stayed in Billings, found some other job, maybe worked in a boarding house, kitchen, or something smaller. Would have been easier. Would you have been happy? No, but I would have been safe. Is that what you want? Safety? Mara set down her fork and looked at him. What I want is to not have to choose between the two. What I want is to live in a world where being good at something is enough, where I don't have to be twice as good as everyone else just to be considered half as competent. What I want is to cook without worrying that every single meal might be the one that proves I don't belong. You do belong. Anyone who's eaten your food knows that. Knowing it and believing it are 2 different things. She pushed her plate away, the steak only half finished. There are nights when I go home and just cry. Not because anything specific happened, but because holding it together all day takes everything I have and there's nothing left when I get back to that empty room. Wyatt reached across the table and took her hand. She didn't pull away. You're allowed to be tired, he said. You're allowed to be scared. You're allowed to be human. That doesn't make you weak. Feels like it does. It doesn't. It makes you real. They sat there for a moment, hands joined across the table, while the cafe filled up around them with the morning crowd. Eventually, Mara pulled her hand back and picked up her fork again. Thanks, she said quietly, for listening, for not telling me it'll all work out or that I just need to think positive or any of that useless garbage people say when they don't know what else to do. I'm not going to lie to you and pretend it's easy, but I'm also not going to let you pretend you're not succeeding, because you are, Mara. You're doing exactly what you said you'd do, and you're doing it better than anyone expected. Except me. I expected this. Then maybe you need to start trusting your own expectations instead of worrying about everyone else's. She smiled at that, small but genuine. When did you get so wise? I'm not wise. I just pay attention. They finished breakfast and Wyatt paid despite Mara's protests, then walked together through streets that were now fully awake and busy with Sunday traffic. At the corner where they'd normally part ways, Mara stopped. Same time next week, she asked. Same time next week. And Boone? Thanks for being here, for staying. I know you could have moved on to the next town, the next job, but you stayed. Didn't seem right to leave. No, she agreed. I suppose it didn't. She headed toward the Northern Star to start prep for the day's service, and Wyatt headed back to his room to catch a few hours of sleep before his evening shift. As he walked, he thought about what Mara had said, about crying in her room at night, about the pressure of carrying other people's livelihoods on her shoulders, about choosing between safety and happiness. He understood more than she probably realized. He'd made the same choice when he decided to stay in Bozeman, when he'd committed to building something instead of just drifting through. It was scary. It was exhausting. Some days it felt impossible. But it was also the first time in years he'd felt like he was moving towards something instead of running from it. And that had to count for something. The weeks turned into months. Winter settling over Bozeman with a cold that made the Montana highlands seem mild by comparison. Snow piled up in the streets, The wind came howling down from the mountains, and people huddled in buildings warmed by wood stoves and tried to wait out the worst of it. Mara's reputation continued to grow. The Northern Star was now the place to eat in Bozeman, and people came from neighboring towns just to try her food. She'd expanded the menu, brought in ingredients from as far as San Francisco and Chicago, turned the hotel dining room into something that rivaled establishments in cities 10 times Bozeman's size. She also worked herself to the point of collapse on a regular basis. Wyatt saw it in the way she moved when they had their weekly breakfasts, slower, stiffer, carrying injuries she tried to hide. Burns that never quite healed before new ones appeared. Cuts that she bandaged and ignored. The persistent cough that came from breathing kitchen smoke for 12 hours a day. "You need to take a day off," Wyatt told her one morning in February, watching her wrap her hand around a coffee cup like it was the only thing keeping her upright. "Can't. We're fully booked for the next month. So get someone else to cover. That's why you have a staff. They're not ready to handle a full service without me. Then they never will be if you don't let them try." Mara gave him a look that said she knew he was right and resented him for it. "One day. I'll take one day off next month." "You said that last month." "And I meant it last month too." She didn't take the day off. She never took the day off. And when she finally collapsed in the kitchen one night in late February, it surprised exactly no one except Mara herself. Wyatt heard about it from Mrs. Patterson, who showed up at the sheriff's office looking worried in a way that immediately set off alarm bells. "Where is she?" Wyatt demanded, already reaching for his coat. "The hotel. The doctor's with her now." Mrs. Patterson wrung her hands. "She just fell, right in the middle of service. One minute she was plating desserts, the next she was on the floor." Wyatt ran the 3 blocks to the Northern Star, took the stairs to the staff quarters 2 at a time, and found Mara in a small room that smelled of medicine and exhaustion. She was conscious, sitting up in bed with the doctor hovering over her, but she looked terrible, pale as snow, shaking, her eyes unfocused. "What happened?" Wyatt asked the doctor. "Exhaustion, dehydration, possible pneumonia. She's been working herself into the ground, and her body finally gave out." The doctor packed up his bag. "I've given her something for the fever. She needs rest, real rest. At least a week, preferably 2. "I can't take 2 weeks, Mara protested, her voice hoarse. "We're fully booked." "You don't have a choice," the doctor interrupted. "You keep pushing yourself like this, and the next time you collapse, it'll be for good. You understand me?" Mara didn't answer, which meant she understood but didn't want to admit it. The doctor left with instructions for medication and rest, and Wyatt pulled a chair up beside the bed. "Don't," Mara said. "Don't start." "I'm not starting anything. I'm sitting here until you fall asleep. Then I'm coming back tomorrow to make sure you're still in this bed and not sneaking down to the kitchen." "I don't need a babysitter." "Too bad. You've got one anyway." They sat in silence while the light faded outside and the sounds of the dinner service drifted up from below. Lynn's voice directing the staff, the clatter of plates, the controlled chaos that Mara normally commanded. "They're doing fine without me," she said finally, and there was something lost in her voice that broke Wyatt's heart. "Listen to them. They don't need me at all. They need you. But they're also capable of handling one night without you, which is different from not needing you." Wyatt leaned forward. "This is what you wanted, remember? A team you could trust. Staff you could rely on. You built this. Now you have to trust it." "What if they realize they're better off without me? What if Mrs. Patterson decides she can hire someone cheaper, someone easier to manage?" "Then she's an idiot. And you go open your own place like you always planned and take your entire staff with you." Mara closed her eyes, tears leaking from beneath her eyelids. "I'm scared, Boone." "I know. I'm scared that if I stop, even for a minute, it'll all fall apart, that I'll lose everything I've built. It won't fall apart. You made it too strong for that." He reached out and took her hand, careful of the burns and cuts. "But if you don't rest now, you're going to destroy yourself. And then it really will fall apart, because there's no Northern Star kitchen without you." She opened her eyes and looked at him. "Stay, please, just until I fall asleep." "I'm not going anywhere." He stayed through that night, and the next, and the one after that. Stayed while Mara slept off the worst of the fever, while the pneumonia loosened its grip, while her body slowly remembered what it felt like to rest. And while she slept, Wyatt thought about what came next. For both of them. Because this couldn't continue. Mara couldn't keep working herself to death, and Wyatt couldn't keep watching her do it without trying to stop her. Something had to change. He just wasn't sure yet what that change would look like. On the 5th day of Mara's forced rest, she was finally strong enough to sit up without the room spinning, which meant she was also strong enough to be furious about being stuck in bed. "I need to get back to work," she told Wyatt that morning, her voice still rough but determined. "Lynn sent word that they're running low on the mushroom stock and nobody knows my recipe. If I don't get down there—" "You're not getting down there," Wyatt interrupted. "You're staying in this bed for at least 3 more days like the doctor ordered." "The doctor doesn't understand what it takes to run a kitchen." The doctor understands what it takes to stay alive, which is more than I can say for you right now." Mara glared at him, but there was no real heat in it. She was too tired to sustain anger for long. "I hate this. Hate being useless." "You're not useless. You're recovering. There's a difference." "Doesn't feel like it." Wyatt pulled the chair closer to her bed and sat down heavily. He'd been wrestling with something for days now, turning it over in his mind during his patrols, during the long hours sitting watch while Mara slept. Now seemed like as good a time as any to say it out loud. "What if you didn't go back?" he asked. Mara looked at him like he'd suggested she sprout wings and fly. "What?" "To the Northern Star. What if you didn't go back there? What if you did what you always said you wanted to do and opened your own place?" "With what money? I've been saving everything I can, but opening a restaurant takes capital I don't have. Equipment, space, supplies, staff. It all costs more than I've managed to put away." "What if you had a partner? Someone who could put up half the money and help run the business side while you focused on the cooking?" She studied him carefully. "What are you saying, Boone?" "I'm saying I've got money saved. Not a fortune, but enough. I'm saying I'm good at dealing with people, at managing problems, at keeping things running smooth. I'm saying maybe we could do this together." Mara was quiet for so long that Wyatt started to think he'd miscalculated badly. Then she said very softly, "Why would you do that? Risk everything you've built here for something that might fail?" "Because watching you work yourself to death for someone else's profit makes me angry. Because you deserve to build something that's yours, not just manage someone else's dream. Because—" He stopped, trying to find the right words. "Because I came to Bozeman following you, and I stayed in Bozeman because of you, and it seems stupid to keep pretending this is about anything other than the fact that I want to be part of whatever you're building." "That's a terrible business justification." "Probably, but it's the truth." Mara closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, they were wet. "I don't want to fail you. If we do this and it doesn't work, then it doesn't work and we figure out what comes next. But at least we tried." Wyatt leaned forward. "You told me once that being scared doesn't change what needs to be done. That you just get up and keep going anyway. So let's get up. Let's do this right." "I'd need to give Mrs. Patterson notice, at least a month, probably more. I can't leave her without a head chef." "So we give her notice. We use that time to find a location, get the equipment, hire staff. We do it the right way. Build a foundation that'll last." "And what about your job? Morrison's not going to be happy if you quit." "Morrison will understand, and if he doesn't, that's his problem, not mine." Wyatt smiled. "Besides, every town needs a restaurant more than it needs another deputy." Mara laughed, which turned into a cough that took a minute to subside. When she could breathe again, she said, "This is crazy. You know that, right? The smart thing would be for you to stay at a steady job with steady pay, and for me to keep working at the Northern Star until I've saved enough to do this on my own. When has either of us ever done the smart thing?" "Fair point." She reached out and took his hand. "Okay, let's do it. Let's build something." The next month was chaos of a different kind than the kitchen chaos Mara was used to. She gave Mrs. Patterson her notice, which the woman took with more grace than either of them expected. Disappointed but understanding, even offering to help spread word about the new restaurant once it opened. Finding a location took 2 weeks of searching every available property in Bozeman. Most were too small, too expensive, or in the wrong part of town. They finally settled on a building on the corner of Main and 5th, formerly a dry goods store that had gone under when the owner moved back east. It needed work, but the bones were good. High ceilings, good ventilation, a large open space that could be divided into kitchen and dining room. The owner wanted more than they could afford. Wyatt negotiated him down by pointing out all the repairs needed and offering to do some of the work themselves. They settled on a price that was still too high but manageable if they were careful. Mara sketched out plans for the kitchen layout with the kind of focused intensity she brought to everything. She knew exactly where every stove, every prep station, every storage area needed to be. Wyatt watched her work and marveled at how someone could hold such a complete vision in their head. "What are we calling it?" he asked one night while they sat in the empty building, surrounded by sawdust and the smell of fresh paint. "The restaurant? I don't know. I've been so focused on making it exist that I haven't thought about what to call it. It should be your name, Holloway's or Mara's or something that makes it clear this is your place." She shook her head. "No, I don't want my name on it. I want people to come for the food, not because they're curious about the woman who cooked it. They're going to come because of you anyway. Maybe, but I'd rather the place stand on its own merit." She looked around the empty space, her expression thoughtful. "What about something simple? Something that says what we're about without being pretentious?" They threw around ideas for an hour, some good, most terrible, all of them rejected for one reason or another. Finally, Wyatt said, "What about the table? Simple, direct, unpretentious. It's where people gather, where they share food and conversation. It's the heart of everything you're trying to build." Mara tested it out, saying it a few different ways. "The table. Dinner at the table. Meet me at the table." She smiled. "Yeah, I like that. The table it is." They hired a carpenter to build out the dining room. Simple wooden tables and chairs, nothing fancy but well-made and sturdy. Wyatt handled the business licenses, the permits, the endless paperwork that came with opening any establishment. Mara focused on the kitchen, spending Wyatt's money with the careful precision of someone who knew exactly what she needed and refused to compromise on quality. She recruited Lynn and Emma from the Northern Star, offering them slightly better pay and the promise of being part of something new. She also hired 2 young women fresh from a cooking school in Chicago who'd come west looking for opportunity and found most doors closed because of their gender. At the table, the only requirement was that you could cook and you were willing to work hard. By late April, they were ready for a soft opening, friends and family only, a chance to work out the kinks before opening to the public. Except neither Mara nor Wyatt had much in the way of family, and their circle of friends in Bozeman was smaller than they'd realized. "We could invite Morrison and the other deputies," Wyatt suggested. "Mrs. Sullivan, the carpenter who did the dining room. That's at least 10 people." "That's pathetic is what it is," Mara said, but she was smiling. "Fine, invite them. And I'll invite Mrs. Patterson and a few of the other hotel staff. We'll fill the place one way or another." The soft opening happened on a Saturday night in May, with 23 people scattered among tables built for 40. It should have felt empty, sparse, like a failure before they'd even begun. Instead, it felt intimate, like a secret shared among people who understood they were witnessing something special. Mara had designed a menu that showcased everything she could do. Dishes that were complex enough to be impressive, but accessible enough that anyone could enjoy them. Roasted chicken with herbs from the garden she'd already started in the small plot behind the restaurant. Fresh trout from the creek, prepared 3 different ways. Vegetables that somehow tasted like the best version of themselves. Bread that Lynn had baked that morning, still warm from the oven. And for dessert, a chocolate torte that made Morrison actually stop mid-conversation and stare at his plate like it had personally offended him by being so good. Wyatt worked the dining room, making sure everyone had what they needed, while Mara commanded the kitchen with the easy confidence of someone in their natural element. Through the open kitchen window, guests could see her moving, directing, tasting, adjusting. A conductor leading an orchestra where the instruments were knives and fire and the raw ingredients of creation. When the last plate had been served and the last guest had left with promises to return, Wyatt found Mara sitting at one of the tables with a glass of wine and an expression he couldn't quite read. "You all right?" he asked, sitting down across from her. "I think I am." "Yeah." She took a sip of wine. "We did it, Boone. We actually did it." "You did it. I just helped with the boring parts." "Don't do that. Don't minimize what you contributed. This place exists because you believed in it when I was too scared to believe in it myself, because you put up your money and your time and your faith that I could pull this off." She met his eyes. "We did this together, both of us." "Together," Wyatt agreed, and there was something in the way she looked at him that made his chest tight. They sat in comfortable silence, the restaurant settling around them, until Mara said, "I need to tell you something about why I really left Billings. You told me they fired you because of how you looked. That's part of it, but it's not all of it." She turned the wine glass between her hands. "There was a man, one of the hotel regulars, wealthy, connected. He decided he wanted me. Not my cooking, me. Started making comments, then advances, then outright demands. When I turned him down, he complained to the owner, said I was unprofessional, difficult to work with, that I made him uncomfortable." Wyatt felt something cold settle in his stomach. What happened? The owner believed him. Of course he did. Rich man's word against a woman who didn't know her place. They gave me a choice: apologize to the man and accept his attention gracefully, or find employment elsewhere. She drained the last of her wine. I chose elsewhere, took everything I'd saved and left town that same week. I'm sorry that happened to you. I'm not. If it hadn't happened, I'd still be in Billings making someone else rich while pretending I was grateful for the opportunity. Instead, I'm here, in my own restaurant, with a partner who sees me as a person instead of a thing to be managed or a problem to be solved. She stood up, slightly unsteady. So no, I'm not sorry. I'm grateful for all of it, even the hard parts. Mara, I love you, Boone. She said it simply, like she was commenting on the weather. I've loved you since you stumbled into my camp half dead and ate my food like it was the first good thing you'd tasted in years. I love that you listen when I talk, that you trust me to know my own mind, that you stayed when you could have left. And I need you to know that before we open this place to the public and everything gets complicated again. Wyatt stood up too, his heart hammering. I love you too. Have for a while now. I just didn't know how to say it without making it weird. Is it weird? Probably. But I don't care. He crossed the space between them and kissed her, gentle at first and then deeper when she kissed him back with equal intensity. She tasted like wine and exhaustion and triumph, and Wyatt thought that if he could freeze one moment in time, it would be this one. When they finally broke apart, Mara was smiling wider than Wyatt had ever seen. Well, that's one more thing figured out. Guess so. We probably shouldn't tell people. At least not right away. Small town like this, if word gets out that the owners are involved, people will talk. Let them talk. We've both survived worse than gossip. True. She looked around the restaurant at the empty tables and the clean kitchen visible through the service window. You know what this means, though? If we're doing this, the restaurant and us, we're in it for real. No backing out when things get hard. I've never been very good at backing out of things. Good. Because I have a feeling things are going to get very hard very fast once we open. She was right. The public opening of the table happened 2 weeks later, and Bozeman turned out in force. They'd advertised in the local paper, put up flyers, relied on word of mouth from the soft opening. But none of them had expected the line that formed outside the restaurant a full hour before they opened the doors. Mara stood in the kitchen staring at the crowd through the window, her face pale. There must be 50 people out there. 63, Wyatt corrected, having just finished counting, and more arriving every minute. We can't seat 63 people. We've got space for 40, maybe 45 if we crowd them. So we do 2 seatings, first group at 6, second group at 8. That's going to put us in the kitchen until midnight. Then we're in the kitchen until midnight. Wyatt put his hands on her shoulders. You can do this. Your team can do this. Trust the foundation you built. Mara took a deep breath, let it out slowly. Okay. Let's do this. They did 2 seatings that night, then 3 the next night, then 4 the night after that. Within a week, they were turning people away and taking reservations 2 weeks in advance. Within a month, they'd hired additional staff and extended their hours just to meet demand. The reviews, when they started appearing in papers as far away as Denver and San Francisco, were unanimous in their praise. Not just for the food, though everyone agreed the food was exceptional, but for the atmosphere, the feeling of the place. One reviewer called it a restaurant that feels like coming home to a home you never had, where strangers become friends over plates of food so honest it'll make you weep. Mara framed that review and hung it in the kitchen where her staff could see it every day. But success brought its own challenges. Suppliers who'd been happy to work with them when they were small suddenly wanted to renegotiate terms now that the table was popular. Competitors who opened copycat restaurants trying to capture some of the same magic. Customers who felt entitled to special treatment because they'd been there since the beginning. And then there was the hate. Because of course there was hate. Letters arrived at the restaurant calling Mara every vile name Wyatt had ever heard, and some he hadn't. Accusations that she'd slept her way to success, that she'd stolen recipes, that the only reason people ate there was curiosity about the freak show in the kitchen. One particularly nasty piece in a rival paper suggested that Wyatt was either a fool or a saint to tie himself to a woman who clearly wasn't suited for polite society. Mara read that one and laughed until tears ran down her face. A fool or a saint? I need to get that embroidered on a pillow. You're taking this better than I expected, Wyatt said, still angry enough to want to track down the writer and have a conversation about journalistic integrity. Why wouldn't I? Look around, Boone. We're packed every night. We're making money. We're employing people and feeding people and building exactly what I said I would build. Some coward with a pen can write whatever they want. It doesn't change the reality of what we've accomplished. Doesn't it bother you at all? Of course it bothers me. But I spent too many years letting other people's opinions control my life. I'm not doing that anymore. She took the paper and tossed it in the trash. Now come on. We've got a full house tonight, and I promised Mrs. Henderson we'd make her husband's birthday special. That was Mara's secret, Wyatt realized. Not that she didn't care what people thought, but that she cared more about the work itself, about the food she created, the space she'd built, the people who came through the doors looking for something good in a world that often felt like it was designed to grind you down. 6 months after opening, the table had become an institution in Bozeman. A year after that, they'd expanded into the building next door, doubling their seating capacity. 18 months in, they were training young cooks who came from all over wanting to learn from Mara Holloway, the woman who'd built a restaurant empire from nothing but skill and stubborn refusal to accept limitations. Wyatt had given up his deputy position to focus full-time on the restaurant, handling the business side while Mara ran the kitchen. It turned out he was good at it, good at negotiating with suppliers, managing staff, dealing with the 1,000 small problems that came with running any business. He missed law work sometimes, missed the adrenaline of breaking up fights and tracking down criminals. But he didn't miss the loneliness, the sense that he was always on the outside looking in. Here, he belonged. He was part of something. They got married on a Tuesday in November, 2 years after Mara had collapsed in the Northern Star kitchen. Nothing fancy, just a quiet ceremony at the courthouse with Morrison and Mrs. Patterson as witnesses, followed by dinner at the table with their staff. Mara wore a simple blue dress, and Wyatt wore his best suit, and when the judge pronounced them married, Wyatt kissed his wife and thought about that first night in the Highlands when he'd stumbled into her camp, more dead than alive. He'd been looking for an outlaw. He'd found something so much better. The restaurant continued to thrive. They weathered economic downturns and harsh winters and the changing tastes of a growing town. They trained dozens of young cooks who went on to open their own places, spreading Mara's philosophy of honest food and equal opportunity across the West. Mara never stopped pushing herself, but she learned to balance the drive that had nearly killed her with the understanding that she couldn't do it all alone. She delegated, she trusted her team, she took Sundays off to rest and spend time with Wyatt. They talked sometimes about what would have happened if things had gone differently, if Wyatt hadn't stumbled into that camp, if Mara had stayed in Billings, if they'd chosen safety over risk. The answer was always the same. They'd be alive, probably, but not living. Going through the motions, but not actually building anything that mattered. On their 5th anniversary, Wyatt gave Mara a gift, a leather-bound book filled with reviews, letters from customers, photographs of the staff, menus from special events, a record of everything they'd built together. On the first page, he'd written, "For Mara, who taught me that strength doesn't always look the way people expect it to, and that sometimes the best thing you can do is refuse to stay small." She cried when she read it, then punched him in the arm for making her cry, then kissed him until they both forgot why they'd been talking in the first place. Years later, when Bozeman had grown from a frontier town into a small city, when the table had become a landmark that people traveled to experience, when Mara's former students were opening restaurants all across the country, someone asked Wyatt what the secret to their success had been. He thought about it for a long time before answering. "The secret," he said finally, "is that we never accepted other people's definitions of what was possible." Mara refused to believe that her worth was determined by her appearance. I refused to believe that law work was the only way to make a difference. And together we refused to believe that success had to look a certain way or come through certain channels. That's it? Just refusing to accept limitations? No, that's not it. Wyatt smiled. The other secret is that we found each other at exactly the right moment, when we were both hungry enough to risk everything and smart enough to know we couldn't do it alone. You can refuse limitations all you want, but it means nothing if you don't have someone standing next to you who refuses them too. The table stood on that corner in Bozeman for 40 years. Mara cooked there until her hands couldn't hold a knife steady anymore, and even then she supervised from a chair in the kitchen, directing her team with the same commanding presence she'd always had. Wyatt worked until the numbers started to blur together, and he could no longer remember which supplier was which, and then he sat in the dining room greeting customers and telling stories about the early days to anyone who'd listen. They'd built something that lasted, something that mattered, something that proved you could take up space in the world unapologetically and create beauty from the simple act of feeding people well. And on quiet nights, when the restaurant was closed and they sat alone at one of the tables drinking wine and watching the moonlight through the windows, Mara would sometimes look at Wyatt and say, "We did all right, didn't we?" And Wyatt would take her hand, still scarred from a lifetime of kitchen work, still strong despite the arthritis that had set in, and answer the same way every time. We did better than all right. We did exactly what we set out to do. We built a life worth living, because that's what it had always been about in the end. Not the success or the recognition or the money, though all of that had come. It had been about two people who refused to accept the world's judgment of their worth, who found each other when they needed it most, and who built something together that neither of them could have built alone. It had been about hunger, not just for food, but for connection, for purpose, for a life that felt meaningful instead of empty, and they'd found it. Right there at the table, in a frontier town that had grown up around them, with each other. Some stories are about heroes who saved the world. This one was about two ordinary people who saved each other, and in doing so, created something extraordinary. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.